From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, November 21. Hello, Chief Political Correspondent Paul Sakal.
Hello, Jacqueline Maley.
So, Paul, recently on this podcast, we've been lamenting the fact that we've been fixated on the Liberal opposition and all of their problems, and we've neglected the Labor government somewhat. They've been given a free ride by this podcast the last few weeks. So this week we're going to focus on Labor, and to that end we have a really, really special treat for listeners, a special guest. We have Sean Kelly, who is a columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and he was previously a Labor staffer with Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. He's the author of a book called The Game, a Portrait of Scott Morrison, and he has just published the latest quarterly essay, which is called The Good Fight, What Does Labor Stand For? Welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Sean, your essay which is a very compelling essay, and it's interesting and it's nuanced and it's well written and it's full of sort of reflection and self-doubt as well as politics and policy, which I love. So it is about politics, obviously, and it's about Labor specifically, but it comes from quite a personal place for you, and I just wanted to start there. Can you tell us briefly about your time with Kevin Rudd and with Julia Gillard, and your support for the Labor cause generally?
Sure. It was an incredibly exciting time working for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and before them, Nicola Roxon, who I always feel bad for. She always gets left out of that equation. She doesn't care. She's gone on to better things than having me as an employee. It was incredibly exhilarating working at the highest levels of government. The adrenaline is incredible. The camaraderie is amazing. There is a sense that you are all working alongside each other in service of a cause. It's perhaps not always clear to everyone exactly what that cause is, but there is nevertheless a sense that you have each other's backs, and that is despite the amazing enmities that exist at times in the Labor Party. There's a sense that you might well hate each other, but you hate the other people even more. So all of that's very exciting.
Even during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, that was the case.
I think that, there was that sense. And, one of the interesting things about those years is that sometimes you would absolutely be working alongside people who you knew were in the other camp. To go to some of the heart of this essay, I worked every day at Question Time Tactics as Julia Gillard's senior press secretary. That was one of my main jobs. Anthony Albanese was leader of the House. We would be there at the same time in that meeting every day. He was obviously a lot more important than I was. And it was, it was no secret there had been a leadership challenge. It was no secret that he was in the Kevin Rudd camp, but he was also working absolutely for the government that Julia Gillard led. And we could have discussions about those things, but there was never any sense of deception. There was, you might know that you were on different sides in a sense, but in the greater fight of every day, you were on the same side.
Yeah.
And I think that was really interesting.
So take us to the heart of the quarterly essay that you've written. You've just said that, you worked very closely with Albanese and you knew him in his professional stead, you knew him in the workplace, and you had quite positive impressions of him as a person and as a politician. But in this essay, you are basically questioning the purpose of his government. So tell us a little bit about what the essay is about.
It came from two places. It came from a day I was driving to pick up my son from childcare, and I called my grandfather's wife, who is a very impressive person, is a real political Cassandra. She told me a long time before Kevin Rudd was removed that the Labor Party would remove him, which was a dramatic prediction at the time, but obviously she was correct. Anyway, that's all irrelevant. She happened to ask me what I believed, and I didn't really have a good answer. And this perplexed me after working for so long.
As in what you
politics.
believed politically in terms of your ideological and political beliefs?
Exactly, how I would articulate it. And it started me thinking about where belief resides in each of us, whether it's a reaction to things. If somebody says something, I may have a strong reaction to it, and that makes me feel like I believe something. But if you ask me what I believe, can I articulate it? Is it an articulated philosophy, or is it just this sense, just this feeling? And so that was kind of one half of it. And then the other half was watching this Labor government and having this sense of Anthony Albanese, as personally, as a man who knew his own mind, knew his own heart, wasn't afraid to say those things. And the sense as well that the government was doing some good things, was Labor tinted in certain obvious ways. Workers, wages, Medicare were central to its concerns. And yet there was something that nagged at me. And it took me a while to figure out what the word for it was. And the word I figured out eventually was belief. What did this government believe? And the two questions come together. What do I believe? What is belief? And what does this government believe? When you really start to interrogate the gap between feeling something and what belief looks like in the world. And the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who's an American, says that belief is a matter of prediction. If it allows you to predict the way somebody will act in the world, then you can say that they believe something. An example given is it's raining, there's water in the gutter, people believe that they will get wet by walking close to it, so therefore you can predict that they will dodge around it. Their belief matches their actions. Essentially, your belief matches your actions. And if you look at the government's actions, if you look at their patterns of behaviour, I think it's much harder to decide what they believe. You can look at Anthony Albanese, you can listen to him, you can think, well, he seems to believe these things, but if you try to work backwards and deduce them from the government's actions, it's less certain. And so really the essay is trying to wrestle with that gap, because I swing wildly in relation to this government. There are days when I think, I'm being unreasonable. They're doing some good things on rights for gig workers or universal childcare. And then there are days when I think, these guys are wasting their chance. They are doing bugger all, and the bits that they are doing incredibly slowly. And the essay really is an attempt to grapple with those two, volatile opinions of mine, which, as I've talked to people, I found it quite common.
Sean, just on Jack's earlier point on us wanting to talk a bit more about the government, I have felt the palpable sense of not putting enough scrutiny on the government in the last couple of months because of how occupied we've been with the opposition. So I just want to give you credit for, in your writing every week or every second week in our paper, continuing to focus on the government and its flaws and the chinks in its armoury as a Labor person yourself. I think it's kind of proved the value of op-eds in my mind, that you've built up this argument over a long period of time. I think you're one of the first to start talking about the government's level of ambition last term. And it's seeped into the debate. Ministers read it, the Prime Minister reads it. They don't read it with joy all the time, and they talk about your column. So it's a good kind of insight into the power of a newspaper columnist. I want to put what I think the counter argument is to your thesis on ambition. I was sitting at Aussie's, the cafe in Parliament, with a minister last Tuesday, and I think they'd just read one of your columns, and they contest it strongly. Their view is that this government has put the country back on the right track on climate, on energy. It's re-engaged with Asia, stabilised relations with China, and done a bunch of big things on the foreign policy front. It's brought wages back up. It's bringing orderly government back after a period of chaos. And yes, there's nothing absolutely transformational there, but given the coalition in the minds of the Labor Party has moved out to the fringe, there is a sense inside Labor now that they are the custodians. They want to be the party of natural government, as the Prime Minister repeatedly says, in part just to occupy the Treasury benches to keep the other guys out, which is a kind of reversion on previous thinking when it was the coalition, because they believed Labor were the radicals, needed to occupy the Treasury benches to stop bad things happening on Labor's part. So how would you respond to that? Do you understand the alternative view that this government is actually has a lot of merit to it?
Oh, look, I absolutely understand it, and I don't entirely discount it. I think that there is a chance that the government's argument that it is behaving responsibly, behaving, as you say, in an orderly manner, that it is acting incrementally, by which it means building up achievements over time, that at the end, as a whole, look much, much larger than they do as individual bits and pieces. I think that argument absolutely may turn out to be true. And I keep an open mind on that, and I keep an open mind on that in the essay. And, because I think outside of the question of judging whether the government is good or bad, I think we should note that everything you're saying reflects a really significant development in our politics, because that argument is the argument that the conservative side of politics has traditionally put for itself. It is essentially,
which argument in particular, Sean?
It's essentially an argument for management. And some of those things are labour-ish things, like rising wages. But for the most part, they are about managing things effectively, managing foreign relations in particular effectively, putting things back on a solid track of stability. And I think you can see this in a lot of the government's rhetoric, and this is one of the things I write about in the essays. Anthony Albanese had this phrase that he started using before the election campaign of the Australian way, and that sounds like a positive doctrine of belief. He later termed it progressive patriotism in an interview with the Herald and the Age. And it started from a place of saying, we don't want to copy the ideologies of any other nation. We don't want to be American. So it came from a kind of negative framing. And Albanese's most famous phrase about himself is, I like fighting Tories, which of course is defining yourself in opposition to your opponents. And when he was asked earlier this year what it meant, he said, it means not giving up the gains that have been made. So both of those things are framed about not doing things, and they're both about protecting Australia as it is, protecting it from American influence, protecting it from having the gains that have already developed here from being torn away. They might be laudable aims. You might even be able to kind of paint them as Labor aims, but they are about defending the status quo. And this ties into exactly what you're saying, Paul, about wanting to be the natural party of government. And I think, this is a really important question. What is lost for a centre-left government when they decide that they want to be the natural party of government?
But Sean, the biggest argument against what you're saying is the voice referendum. And Anthony Albanese stated that as his first priority, basically, when he gave his election night speech, when he won the election against Morrison. And then he went ahead and he did it. And it would have been, it was presented as a very radical reform, whether or not you believe that would have been the case. It was certainly a difficult reform that was not at all central to the concerns of most voters. I think we can say that. It would have been a big change because it was a constitutional change. He's burnt a lot of political capital on it, and obviously he didn't succeed. But he did try something really big.
Look, I completely agree. I think the voice was a courageous decision. It was courageous that he continued on with it. There are a lot of critics of that decision. I understand where they're coming from, but I think that you can argue, and I do argue, that it was the right thing to do. And I think this is a really interesting issue about timing in relation to this government. In Anthony Albanese's first term, he did two really difficult things. One was the Voice campaign, and one was breaking his promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts. They both happened in the second year of 3, which meant that at the end of that year, he still had a year to recover if both went pear-shaped. Only one did, but if both had gone pear-shaped, he still had a year to recover before the election. And he proved himself very good at recovering in a few months before the election. And Prime Ministers tend to get into habits. I think they often do something, it works for them, especially when it works and helps them win an election. They think, well, I will try that trick again. And so I think there is every chance that as we head into the second year, which will pretty much be in after the summer break, we'll start to see the government try some hard things again. And I think that, the other big caveat you have to place on criticisms of the government is that inflation was a massive, massive factor in the first 3 years. And arguably, it still is a factor, I think, more than it is mostly acknowledged in the political debate. I think people...
It's certainly a factor in people's minds. And I think, you can have economic data, the economic data shows that it's easing, it's coming off, but it's still front of mind for a lot of people, and life is expensive for a lot of people. You talk in the essay about conflict and how Labor has become quite conflict averse. So they've maybe been a bit burned by the Rudd-Gillard years in terms of taking on big interests. So they don't want to have a big fight with something like the gambling lobby, because they've really basically lost their spine over gambling reform, it seems. and also that they're not having fights within themselves or healthy conflict within the caucus. So, you know, and you sort of make the argument that if the coalition ever does get its act together and they actually do have to proactively kind of state a case or take a case for reform or for policy to the Australian people, they will have lost that art. Tell me why you think they need to retain the fight, because, as you say, Albo likes to fight.
You asked me at the start what my experience of working in the Rudd and Gillard governments was, and I said how exciting it was, and that's true. And it was also incredibly bleak and depressing at times. And
I was there. I was on the other side, I remember, yeah.
You remember how bleak and depressed I was at times. And afterwards, and I know I am not alone in this, I really battled in thinking through everything that had happened during those years and what mistakes I'd made and what I could have done differently. And of course, cabinet ministers from that time have gone through the same process, and they dominate the Rudd-Gillard cabinet. Sorry, they dominate the Albanese cabinet. The mistake is easy to make for exactly this reason. And I think they have internalised they've internalised the difficulties that government faced, and you can absolutely understand that. And so I think those battles with big business have really scarred them. And then they've also internalised this sense of not wanting conflict internally. And I think this is a huge mistake, because while it is true that the Rudd-Gillard government's disunity tore it down eventually, that's not where the problem started. The problem started with a bunch of MPs who were completely united, who would not say anything to an incredibly strong and electorally successful Prime Minister. And
that's true.
That eventually led to problems because problems festered and were left too late. And it feels like we might be closer to that situation than the other.
Well, then it became a conflict of egos. Like it was completely about egos battling it out, and it was nothing about the Australian public, and it was nothing about policy.
And if Rudd-Gillard has been a huge part of determining this government's attitude to how they go about things, I think the other big moment that plays a big role in how they think about risk is the Shorten-Morrison 2019 election. A lack of appetite to take on a big fight over tax or economic policy that might spark a reaction. I think you saw that with the Prime Minister's back down on the pretty small $3 million super tax idea, which caused a lot of heartache for Jim Chalmers. And
I was thinking about this, like, which big interests have they taken on? They've taken on big tech, you could say, with the social media reforms, but I don't see any political downside in that, because big tech is based in the United States, first of all, and it's, these kind of billionaire, tech bro oligarch types who have no natural sympathy with the Australian people and no lobbying interests here. But Sean, tell us, I mean, you talk about the kinds of things, if Labor was to make big, bold reforms, or it was to get its fight on and actually take on some interests to better the nation, you do identify some problems, like really deep-seated, kind of depressing problems that they should be turning their minds to. Tell us about that.
I think most of us are aware, increasingly I think that there is something, I don't know how to put this, not quite right in the way that we live. Phones are too big a part of our life. There's this sense that we always need to be productive all of the time. And you can see the kind of correlative of this in the facts around our politics. You look at the education system and you see the inequality that is widening up. I've taken to describing it as an effectively segregated school system between private schools and public schools. I learned, I think last year, that you would expect the school system to shrink the inequality between advantaged and disadvantaged students. Our school system does the opposite. Students are further apart by the end of the 12 or 13 years. And that seems to me a perversion of what the school system should be doing. Housing, obviously we know people can't afford houses without rich parents. The chasm between one side of society and the other side is getting wider and wider. And where once upon a time you could say, well, there are a bunch of people who are doing it tough and perhaps the government's not looking after them enough. I mean, certainly the government has not historically looked after them enough. That group is growing larger and larger. And I think this inequality is a significant problem. I think that we are a bit complacent here in thinking that we can never get to the place that pretty much every other country has gotten to at some point, which is inequality widens dramatically, increases dramatically, and political problems come out of that. People start to be attracted far more to the extremes. We think that compulsory voting is a real protection against that. But I think we should keep in mind the possibility that, as Andrew Leigh, a Labor frontbencher, has said, on current trend lines, we are a generation away from US-style inequality. That is a really worrying statistic.
It's the sense, I think, that you can't work your way out of it. Like you can't get a good job, a good education. You can't get a good job. You can't work hard to bring opportunity to yourself and to your family, which is very, as you say, it does have, it's a recipe for sort of great social division. Sean, I mean, if you were in government now, if you were advising the Prime Minister, not just on question time tactics, unfortunately question time isn't nearly as exciting these days as it was back then, we can say that at least. What would you be telling him? What would you be pushing and nudging him to do?
Oh, look, I mean, first up, I don't envy anyone there. One of the things this government will I think this government believes is that the reform landscape is much harder than it used to be. Now, I don't.
Do you think that's true?
I don't know. We were talking before about Bill Shorten, and I think Paul's absolutely right that really lingers. But I think not that much significant reform has been tried in the social media era, in the polarised era. So we don't really know. And when Labor looks at those things, the carbon price, say, well, that was tried when Julia Gillard was facing a storm of misogyny and Kevin Rudd was right behind her. Bill Shorten was trying to do these things from opposition. Trying to make big reforms from opposition has always been incredibly difficult. Trying to make them from government is a whole different thing. So no, I think reform might be more possible than we have come to believe. And I think this government has advantages that other governments generally don't have. We have a Prime Minister with decades of parliamentary experience. We have an experienced cabinet. We have a government facing a depleted opposition, and it has a huge majority. I think more might be possible than this Labor government has allowed itself to believe. What should they be trying to do? I mean, I can pull out a couple of things. I think it is amazing that the Gonski reforms, which is one of this government's proudest achievements, delivering in full on the funding that public schools need. It's something that they boast about, and fair enough, except that some schools in states won't get that full funding until 2034. So there are kids starting school now who won't get the funding that they're supposed to get until they're almost at the end of their schooling. That's one thing. You could speed that up. I think you should fix the university funding fees mess. And I think you could do a lot more on housing. One of the things that really shocks me, among our productivity summits and our economic reform summits, or whatever all the titles that they've had, jobs and skills summits, is that the government, I don't think so, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't just had a massive housing summit and then come out at the end of the housing summit and gone, we're going to do every single thing that has been put to us. Negative gearing by itself, capital gains by itself, is not going to fix the supply problems about housing, but they are going to do a fair bit to address inequality. And
or at least, at least roll it back. It's such low-hanging fruit. Like maybe just limit it to, 2 investment properties, not 10.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there is more on all these areas, and I guess I'd go back to. It's almost this. It's not exactly that there's this thing they haven't done, as this particular thing they haven't done. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, obviously huge reformer, huge reforms in the New Deal. Some people say actually it was incrementalism. Actually, he did a bunch of small things and they added up. But also he did this. He tried lots of things, and he said that. He said, try something. If it fails, try something else. And I think one of the difficulties with this government's slow-moving approach is not that they're doing nothing. It's not that they're doing quite enough or quite large enough things to know that things don't work in order to be able to try something else. Instead, I think because they're doing this smattering of things quite slowly, the things that they're doing, inevitably, a fair portion of what you try in government doesn't work. And so if you look at some of the areas they're operating in at the moment, there are signs that they won't hit their renewable energy target, that they won't hit their emissions targets, that they won't hit their housing target, and try more stuff. I think would be the big suggestion.
I think your one of your early answers, Sean, you said that the second year of this government will be an important one. I think that's right. That's the way that the people in and around the cabinet are thinking about this term, that this year's the year of delivery. And once Christmas comes, they can start to have a think about how they broaden their agenda, not to go vastly beyond the mandate, but to do more in the economic space, do more in the social space, and potentially to move back into the Indigenous field, which they've just vacated since The Voice. And I think it's also worth just noting that while this government looks, supremely successful because of the last election result, in which everything went wrong for the coalition. Peter Dutton's campaign was a mess. The Trump factor was big, and everything went right for Labor. It was a brilliant campaign from Paul Erickson. But there were long periods of the last term where, because of this, as you describe it, lack of ambition, the government appeared to be drifting. There was a period leading up to the Dunkley by-election at the start of, I think it was 24, where before they made the stage 3 tax change, there was a real sense of drift, real sense of question around what the government was up to, and they needed a circuit breaker because this slow pace, no huge reform agenda style wasn't working for people. So it's not a model that is always successful, and I think the people around the Prime Minister know that the biggest risk he has is to just bask in this popularity and not thrust forward. So I think the second year will be an important year to see what the character of this government is.
Yeah, look, Wayne Swan, the party president, I think you wrote about this, Paul.
Yeah, that speech,
gave a really interesting speech because actually it was a pretty dark speech. He talked about Labor support being wide but shallow. He talked about complacency being the handmaiden of decline, and essentially the pride always came before a fall, that you always felt you were a hero. He talked about Paul Keating in 93 becoming a zero in 1996. And alongside it, he made this really interesting point about the greatest number of Labor supporters still are there because they were inspired by Gough Whitlam. And Swanee isn't the type of person to make a really sharp point against anyone in politics right now, but I felt that was as close as he was likely to come to making a really serious warning.
And it was his last major speech as president, and he thought about it a lot. I remember speaking to him in the lead up. He felt it was an important contribution that he knew would fuel conservative arguments around the government's election mandate, because he acknowledged what a lot of coalition people believe, which was that, yes, they have a huge majority, but their primary vote is low and they're not healthy as an institution.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that they've always got to keep that front of mind, don't they? That only 1 in 3 Australians, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons why Albanese is so cautious and conflict averse and intent on bringing people together or bringing people along with him, because, only 1 in 3 people voted for Labor at the last election, despite their huge majority.
He's a realist, total realist. He's looking at what's going on in the UK, where the Labor Party's been pulled apart by the Corbyn side of the party, and the Greens are thriving there. He's looking at the Democratic Socialists in the US with Mamdani showing what they can do to the centre left. So he has a strong argument to make that he's kept the centre left together and developed a coherent model, but the ambition side of the Labor Party, which Sean is kind of advocating for, will always be an important part of the equation as well.
And this is why
it's the engine.
This is why the second year is so interesting, I think, because every leader's strengths eventually become their weaknesses. And Anthony Albanese's strength has clearly been his caution. It clearly worked for him at the last election, in amongst a whole bunch of other factors, as you say, Paul. But they start to lean on those strengths. They start to think, this thing worked for me, I'm going to lean on it. And eventually, it turns out to be the wrong tool for the time. And I think that will happen at some point. And a real question for this second year is whether Anthony Albanese learns to balance that caution, or I should say perhaps repeats the balancing act he managed in that second year of his first term.
Yeah. Complacency is the hallmark of decline. Wayne Swan. I'm going to tell that to my daughter next time she refuses to brush her teeth or do some important task. Tooth decay and decline. Sean, it's been so much fun talking to you and so interesting. And thank you for thinking through all these issues and taking your enormous intellect and insight into this problem, because they're all important problems that we're talking about. I think sometimes we treat politics really flippantly, but we forget that it has the power to change people's lives, and that's what we're talking about today. So thank you, Sean. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jack.